Okay, folks, we are back again for another edition of 5 Minute Football. I am Mike Waxman with College Football Focus, and today we are going to wrap up our conference preview series. Today we are going to look at the Mountain West, which is always a fun and high-scoring league. We're happy today to welcome in Patrick Mayhorn from the Aggship. They cover Utah State sports in depth and in general, especially football and basketball, but they do talk about other stuff. And Patrick used to be here in Columbus with me. We had some overlap at our employer covering Ohio State. Patrick, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Mike. I'm happy to be here. Happy to talk about the Mountain West. It is always pretty crazy, and I don't think that this season's going to be any different. So I'm looking forward to it.
No, it will not. There's certainly a lot of storylines to kind of cover, and I guess the first one is the expanded playoff. Certainly, Boise State is a team that is getting a lot of publicity, along with the other characters: Liberty, Memphis, maybe a Texas State and App State. Boise State has had some turnover, but they also have a lot of crucial players back. Um, do you think that they have a really legitimate shot at nabbing that group of five auto bid for the expanded CFP this season?
I do. I think if we're looking purely at the roster and the production they bring back, they really probably should be one of the top teams contending for that. They have, I mean, one of the best running backs in the country with Ashton Genty. They went through a youth movement on defense last year and brought back basically every single guy who was part of that. They bring in Malachi Nelson at quarterback. They have, a returning quarterback with Maddox Madsen, who was pretty good last season when he did play. The question is just Spencer Danielson, right? He's coached 4 games and he did enough to get the full-time job last season. I don't know that Boise State had a ton of choice in that matter, given that he won a conference championship and, managed to keep the roster around. But we don't really know what he looks like as the full-time head coach because he's only coached 4 games. And that's kind of the biggest question that I have about them is that the coaching was kind of shaky last year at times, and most of that staff is back with Danielson. And so I think the roster is good enough, but the roster has been good enough for years and years at Boise State, and that has not always been it's not always led to them being completely dominant in the Mountain West.
Right, and we'll get a pretty good gauge on them early because they face Oregon.
Yeah.
So we will see if that game is respectable. Then Boise probably does move to the head of the line for the G5 because the schedule sets up pretty well for them as far as the vital games being at home.
Yeah, for sure. And there are landmines in this conference. I have their schedule here. Let me look at this real quick. Yeah, they got at Hawaii, at UNLV. Those are tricky games. At Wyoming, I think Wyoming's defense is going to be excellent. But they do get Utah State at home. They get Wazoo and Oregon State at home. They get San Diego State at home. It's manageable. I believe they dodge Fresno State, which is probably the other best team in the conference. They can certainly work with this, and I think that should be the expectation heading into the year.
I would agree. They're definitely a team to watch. Moving on, I think a lot of people talk about in the Power Four. They talk about when Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, these teams that are just deep with receivers and all of the receivers that are in the Power Four. But if people don't follow the Mountain West, I mean, Ricky White, Torrey Horton, Jalen Royals, there is a deep roster of receivers that are probably going to be NFL guys from the Mountain West. Is that maybe the position of strength in the conference? And just talk a little bit about those guys. Like, how do these guys not have how did they not have higher profiles and get to bigger schools? Because all of these guys can ball.
Yeah, there's a really good wealth of talent at receiver in this conference. Hawaii has a great room. Torrey Horton, like
Mhm.
you mentioned, Jalen Royals, I got to see up close last season, is excellent. He really kind of took about a month to get into the role because he had never. I mean, he was a JUCO guy and came to Utah State and got an offer at a camp that he wasn't invited to because he ran a 4.4. And beyond that, Ricky White, of course, is excellent. They've got Jacob DeJesus as well out at UNLV. Is very good. I think that probably is the best position in the conference. I would say like last year it was probably defensive end. There were some very, very good defensive ends in the league, and there still are good defensive ends in the league, most of which are at Boise State. But the receivers have been good for a while now. The conference has a bit of a reputation for good receivers, and I think that the top end is as good as it has been, at least as good as I've seen for this league. You know, Horton catches everything. His catch radius is massive, and he's seemingly always open. Jalen Royals is legitimately it's legitimate 4.4 speed. He is as fast as anybody on the field, and he has the kind of athleticism that you just really even power conference cornerbacks. He's just really hard to deal with. Even if he's covered, he's hard to deal with. UNLV threw the ball for about 1 million yards last season and still has very good receivers. There's a lot of access to receiver talent out here. There's a lot of access in California. You have a lot of really good JUCO receivers you see come up to the Mountain West. I think that would definitely be the strength of the league this season. Running backs are generally pretty strong and probably will be strong again this year, but the top end receiver talent is really, really impressive.
Yeah, I think that if people have a chance on a given Saturday, if there aren't a whole lot of marquee Power Four games, maybe turn on a Mountain West game, and you're almost guaranteed to see somebody balling out at receiver.
Yeah,
The league has really gotten an infusion of new coaches. Half the league, I think, maybe even a team or two more than half the league, with
yeah,
new coaches on the sidelines. Certainly, some intriguing ones. Ken Niumatalolo comes from option heavy Navy to San Jose State. You've got Sean Lewis at San Diego State. You've got Jay Sawvell at Wyoming, and just a host of guys. Who were maybe a couple of the new coaches that you have your eye on that you really think could be intriguing fits and maybe can have their teams improving sooner rather than later?
the one that really has come to mind for me in thinking about that throughout the offseason is Sean Lewis. I thought that it was a really, really smart hire when San Diego State made it. I thought that it was the move they needed to make. The system that they were running with Hoke and Rocky Long worked for a really long time and did its job and established that program. But it was probably time to embrace being in San Diego, being in California, start to actually throw the ball a little bit more. And it's going to take a minute, probably, I think, to turn that roster around and to get it into a system that's so different from what they were doing. But they brought in a good transfer class. I think AJ Duffy is there from Florida State at quarterback. I don't know exactly how good they're going to be in year one, but I do think that that's a really smart fit. And I think it's something that will work out long term. Um, Bronco Mendenhall at New Mexico, I thought was another really smart hire, just a great program builder for a program that needed to be built. And then you have some of the guys who are taking over as, internal promotions. Sawvell, Tim Skipper, most recently at Fresno State, taking over for Jeff Tedford, Nate Dreiling at Utah State, Spencer Danielson, who I mentioned earlier. Kind of a spectrum of what to expect from those teams this year, where I think that Wyoming and Boise State and Fresno State, I suppose, are all really expecting to contend this season, and Utah State's sort of a wild card. But it's always kind of an unknown with guys like that. Whereas Sean Lewis, we have a decent sample size of what he can do. We don't know. I mean, Nate Dreiling is 33 years old. He's never been
Right.
a head coach. He's the youngest head coach in the FBS. I don't know what to expect from him as a head coach. I don't really know what to expect from Sawvell or Danielson or any of these guys. Um, and so I'm interested to see what that looks like, especially with three of them taking over probably three of the four best teams heading into this season.
Well, anytime we can get Bronco Mendenhall back in coaching, I think it's a good
Yes.
thing. So,
Yes.
um, and I guess last, do you like the kind of the addition, not addition? I mean, it's kind of half and half. The Oregon State and Washington State, they're not in the conference standings, but they are going to play
Yeah.
basically a Mountain West schedule. Is that something you like, or is it something like it's going to maybe gum up the works because it reduces the conference games down to 6 or 7 games for people?
Yeah, if it turns into full membership, I would like it. If it is a temporary patch that then leads to basically the dissolution of the conference, I would not be super thrilled about that because for this season specifically, it's not ideal. There are no more divisions and everybody's playing 7 conference games.
Mhm.
It's not a large enough sample size if you don't also have divisions to split these teams. And I, I'm in favor always of more conference games. I like the 9 game conference schedules. And being down to 7 and adding these games in the short term is a bummer. It's going to create fewer games with high stakes because those games don't go into the standings. But if the long term payoff is that you get those two teams into the league, I think they're great cultural fits. I think that they're schools that would do really well within the Mountain West. I would live with it for a year or two.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a little bit odd to see. I mean, every week Oregon State, you're used to them playing UCLA, USC, and here they're playing San Jose State or they're playing
Yeah,
Utah State. So it's going to take a little bit of getting used to. But I think you're right. If long term, if it pays off that they are additions to the league, then it ends up being good. But if this is just a trial balloon and they end up somewhere else, or some of the teams from the Mountain West end up somewhere else, then you're probably right. It probably is not the best thing in the world.
yeah.
Um, all right, well, that's a pretty good rundown of some of the big storylines for the year. If people want to find you on social media and find the Aggship, what is it that they need to look for?
Yeah, it's just at the Aggship on Twitter. It's www.theaggship.com. Coverage of Utah State athletics, like you said, mostly football and basketball, but we do all sorts of stuff. Yeah, that's the main place is Twitter at the Aggship, and then the website.
All right, well, we are only a little more than a week away from football kicking off and getting through a new season. The Mountain West is experimenting with some stuff, and college football has like a new expanded playoff, and most conferences have no division. So it's kind of a new trip into a new frontier. So we'll see if how it works out. And thanks again for coming on. We may check in maybe at the halfway point of the season, see how some of these things have shaken out, and maybe what some of the new storylines are. So again, thanks a lot for coming on, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks for having me.